How does one get into the Fate franchise? This question has been asked many a times, and many people have tried to answer. Many a war has been fought on this topic, many people screaming, many fans disappointed, many fans dead. But don't worry, they can rest now, for I will give the definitive, absolute, perfect way to get into the Fate franchise. Let's begin. When you think of Fate, you tend to think of Fate Stay Night, and when you look at the timeline, you're only really looking at a bunch of loosely connected titles. Fate titles are not actually that connected with each other. Each title tends to have its own characters, and are only very loosely connected with other titles. Most of them are like alterations to the original concept. The original concept is that there's a Holy Grail War. The Holy Grail War is a ritual in which modern day wizards called mages summon historical figures, aka servants, to fight in a Holy Grail War. Having summoned servants, the mages become the master of the servant and need to defeat the other masters to acquire the Holy Grail, which is a wish-granting device. The power of the servant depends on how famous it is and how old it is. The more famous the servant is in the region, the more powerful it is. The older the servant, the more powerful it is. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, this is true. As an example, one of the most powerful servants you can summon is Hercules in Greece. Because of the fame bonus and the age, he is practically invincible. Now then, let's move on to the actual titles, starting with Fate Stay Night. Fate Stay Night originally released as a visual novel with 3 main endings, one for each heroine. You have Saber, which is the Fate ending, Rin, which is the Unlimited Blade Works ending, and Sakura, which is the Heaven's Feel ending. There is a manga adaptation for each route, with the Fate route being the oldest and only finished adaptation. The Unlimited Blade Works adaptation has recently started, and the Heaven's Feel adaptation for the manga has been going on for 8 years now. There is also an anime adaptation for the Fate route and Unlimited Blade Works route, the Saber and Rin route respectively. There is also a movie adaptation for the Unlimited Blade Works route and the Heaven's Feel route. Out of the 2 adaptations, I recommend the anime more than the movie. The Heaven's Feel route is divided into 3 movies. Personally, I've watched all of them and I thought it was an enjoyable experience. These movies came out in 2017, 2019, and 2020. Now with this information in hand, I will tell you how I think you should get into Fate Stay Night if you're interested in this title. I personally recommend either reading the visual novel, reading the manga adaptations, watching the Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works anime, or watching the Fate Stay Night Heaven's Feel movies. But one of the most important things to keep in mind is which heroine you would like to see win. For example, if you'd like to see Sakura win, it'd be recommended to watch the Heaven's Feel movies or read the manga. For Rin fans, it would be the Unlimited Blade Works anime, manga, visual novel, whatever. Just don't watch the movie. But for Saber, she's a bit more complicated. Unfortunately, her adaptations have been a mixed bag. With her adaptations, they try to combine multiple routes into one, creating like a big mess really. So yeah, we're still looking forward to a Fate remake maybe? Anyways, on to the next title, Fate Grand Order. Fate Grand Order is the mobile game and probably the most popular version currently. It's a gacha game where you can get units by rolling with currency that you can pay for. Honestly, the main reason to play this game is to experience the story. The gameplay, in comparison, is a bit of a letdown, especially compared to modern day gacha games. The story is divided into 2 parts and events. Events are quirky storylines that aren't directly related to the plot. Part 1 is the first half of FGO. Part 1.5 takes place between Part 1 and 2 and are called the Epics of Remnants. Part 2 comes afterwards and is the current story we are on. The story's overall quality varies a lot. Unfortunately, since FGO was one of the first gacha games, the story is extremely mediocre up till around the first half of Part 1. It gets better afterwards, but there are still a bit of down points. Unfortunately, it isn't as simple as Fate Stay Night to get into without actually playing the original game. There are great manga adaptations, for example, where the manga improves on the story, especially in the first half of Part 1. But for an anime enjoyer, it will be difficult, because the anime is primarily focused on pleasing game players and can be difficult to get into without already playing the game. The same can be said about the movies, where you really have to already know the story in order to enjoy them. There's also a downside to just reading the manga, since it really only covers Part 1 for now. Even then, it can be a bit difficult to get into the manga. Part 1 is divided into 8 parts, not including the prologue. There are 2 manga adaptations, Tourist Ryota and Moristella. Tourist Ryota covers the prologue, Part 1, 3, 5, 7, and 8, and Moristella covers the prologue, Part 1, 2, 4, 6, and 8. While this is a complicated and nonsensical way to divide the parts, you don't actually need to read the other to get like a full view of the story. Each adaptation gives a brief summary of the parts skipped. Epic of Remnant is divided into 5 parts, each part having a manga adaptation. These are called Shinjuku, Agartha, Shimosa, Salem, and CCC. Each adaptation has a different manga artist, and each are really good. Shinjuku is well done, Agartha improves on the game's story, Shimosa has really well done art, Salem's a good adaptation, and CCC also expands on the plot a bit more. In summary, the manga adaptation is great for Fate Grand Order, so far at least. Let's talk about the movies. One thing that is extremely strange is that for Part 6 of Part 1, which is called Camelot, they decided to adapt the play version of the game instead of the actual game. This is divided into two movies, Part 1 Camelot and Part 2 Camelot. Part 1 Camelot can be extremely boring and is very limited. Part 2 focuses a lot more on action and is great. Having said this though, you should not watch Camelot if you don't know the story for Part 6 of Part 1 already. There's also a movie for Part 8 called Solomon. And yeah, it's pretty good as a Fate fan, but it would be pretty hard to understand just going into it. You would basically have to know all of Part 1 going into the movie. For anime, there is the First Order, which is the prologue, Absolute Demonic Battlefront, which is Singularity 7, or Part 7 of Part 1. The OVA, which is the intermission between Part 1.5 and Part 2. There's also the Learning with Manga anime adaptation, which is really just a joke for Fate Grand Order fans already. There's also Fate Grand Carnival, which is also a joke. And there's also Ritsuka Doesn't Understand, which is a joke for Part 2. My recommendation is to read the manga, as I believe it is the best adaptation for Part 1 and 1.5. The anime is fine to watch Singularity 7. And as I said before, the movie adaptations are really only good for people who already know the story. If you want to see Part 2, the only way currently, I believe, is to just watch the cutscenes of the gameplay. And I only recommend playing the game if you have a gacha addiction and you want to spend money on a game. There is also a light novel adaptation for one of the events, but that's a whole nother can of worms. That's it for FGO. I'll be moving on to other titles now. Let's talk about Fate Apocrypha. Fate Apocrypha was originally a light novel. It has since been adapted into a manga and anime. The manga is still ongoing, but is nearing completion. Fate Apocrypha has its own take on the Holy Grail format. It takes place in Romania and features a team battle system. It's a 7v7 Holy Grail war. This Holy Grail also features a popular character known as Astolfo. I believe the best adaptation for this light novel is the manga. From what I've read, there isn't really a dull moment in the manga. Although I haven't seen the anime, people tend to be dissatisfied with it. And as such, I believe the manga is probably the better way to enjoy it. The original light novel is also out there. On to the next series. I will now proceed to butcher this name. Fate Lost in Herhar takes place in the Fate Apocryphal world, 10 years later. It's a Holy Grail war that takes place in Norway. I have limited knowledge about it, as only the light novel is out currently, and it is only in Japanese. Getting back to series related to Fate Stay Night, I'm going to start with Fate Zero. Fate Zero is a what-if prequel to Fate Stay Night. It is not actually a prequel due to some issues with it. There's a bit of lore and character discrepancies, and as such, it becomes a what-if prequel for Fate Stay Night. It was originally a light novel, but has since been adapted into an anime and manga. Both the anime and manga seem to be very enjoyable. I personally haven't seen the anime, but I read 2 volumes of the manga in a public library around 10 years ago. Next thing I will be talking about is Fate Hollow Axtria. I also butchered that name. This is a sequel to Fate Stay Night, but it is only really out in visual novel format. In order to play it in English, you also need a fan translation. There are anthology mangas out based off of it. Next on the list is today's menu for the Emiya family. This is basically a cooking spin-off for Fate Stay Night. This is out in both manga and anime format. There also was a game released for it on the Nintendo Switch in 2021. Really only get into this if you've seen Fate Stay Night. Next is Fate Caliad Linear Prisma Ilia. This is Fate, but with magical girls. This is an alternate universe to Fate Stay Night. I personally haven't read much of it, or watched any of it, but the anime seems to really be lolly bait, and from what I understand, the manga is actually pretty decent. So if I was to choose an adaptation, it would probably be the manga. Oath Under Snow is a movie prequel for Prisma Ilia. It seems to be well done, but I've never seen it myself. Next up is the Fate Extra series. Fate Extra is an RPG game for the PS Portable. Fate Extra has a completed manga adaptation as well. There are sequel games for this as well, some of them being Fate Extra CCC, Fate Extra Estella, Fate Extra Link, and a few more. There are also a few manga spin-offs for these titles as well, such as Fate Extra CCC Foxtail. Personally, I'm waiting for the Fate Extra remake, Fate Extra Record, to be released in order to get into this series. There is also an anime out called Fate Extra Lost Encore. This anime is a bit difficult to get into if you aren't a Fate Extra fan. I've personally watched all of this anime, and since I've never played Fate Extra before, or seen the manga to completion, I got confused a lot, and I really don't understand the anime at all. As such, I do not recommend looking at the anime until you've played Fate Extra. It seems to be an anime for Fate Extra fans. Moving on to the next title, Fate Strange Fate. This is currently out as a light novel and manga, but an anime special will be airing during July 2023. This is essentially a what if the Holy Grail War took place in America instead. Another interesting tidbit about this Holy Grail War is that it has more servants than normal. Moving on, there's Fate Requiem. Fate Requiem is a novel series of a world after the Holy Grail War. There is currently no adaptation in manga or anime form. The next title is my favorite, Fate Redline. This title pleases the edge inside of me. It's a manga with really good art, and it's a Holy Grail War that takes place during Imperial Japan in World War II. It is currently ongoing, but I highly recommend everyone to read it. Overall, I don't think it's that difficult to get into Fate. The main question is, which one do you start with? And that ultimately is up to your decision. Do you like reading manga, or do you like watching anime? As a manga reader, you could really just start with anything. But with anime, it's a bit more difficult as many adaptations are not actually that great. For anime onlys, I recommend starting with Fate Zero or Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works. If you're fine watching movies, watch the Heaven's Feel trilogy. For gamers, you can play through the Fate Extra series, but I personally recommend waiting for the remake. The original Fate Stay Night visual novel is also a good starting point. There's also another Fate game coming out soon called Fate Samurai Remnant. Fate Samurai Remnant seems to be an action RPG. We currently don't have that much information out for it, so I personally hope that's a good game. Anyways, that's really it. Comment if you have questions, you want to correct some information about this, you have a different opinion. But yeah, the one thing you should take away from this video is read Fate Redline. Thanks for watching.